how the construction of whiteness and how the construction of American identity in relation to the West, we can't understand it unless we understand the first peoples who were here. And so, because a lot of the characterization of those peoples and the characterization of, the justification for their removal, and in some cases, sort of exclusion onto reservations, and in some cases extermination, is those justifications in the face of the tragedy of what happens to Native Americans. Those justifications then build up and are then applied to other groups as well. And so that's one of the connections. Another one of the connections is the connection of the American, I'm talking about Anglo settlers in particular, but I'm talking about the larger migration, Irish, et cetera. The notion of difference. I mean, there's you might be aware of a famous work by Edward Said, Orientalism, about the characterization of the other in, this is global process, but the characterization of the other, especially by Europe and of course by the United States, of and the Native Americans do become the other very early on in American history. We saw that when we looked at the 17th century and Jamestown, et cetera. But you also see this process with Asian migration, which has to do, and I think there's a deeper thing to research here about literacy and writing, right? That Asian character sets, for instance, are something that are not understandable by, you can read to a certain extent Spanish, you can sound it out, right? If you are, familiar with, English, you can kind of, those are all the sort of these European languages that the difference of and characterizing as other Native Americans and Asians, there's this characterization of them as, the other in American society that is not, for instance, using European languages. And I think there's something interesting there about the kind of irrational fears that are directed towards Asians in San Francisco and Los Angeles during this period of time, and similar to the ways that Native American languages are seen. It's just seen as something that is not part of this sort of supposedly foreordained manifest destiny European expansion into the West. And that's where we really come to the issue of manifest destiny, or the concept of manifest destiny, which has so many different sort of meanings to it, at least in terms of how it, the word, the concept predates the word, right? The concept is it goes back all the way to a certain extent to John Winthrop in Massachusetts, this idea of a city on a hill, this idea of, the exceptionalism of America, the exceptionalism of the expansion of English, dissident populations, and then white populations moving west, that being in some way religiously foreordained, that being something sort of that God has made for those settlers. In its most pernicious form, of course, we can see that used as not only a justification for wars against Native Americans, but as kind of like a kind of shrug regarding the suffering that they endured because of repeated waves of disease and marginalization and denial of basic citizenship rights once you have United States formed. So all of those ideas about manifest destiny predate the coining of the term in 1845 in the Democratic Review, and we've all heard the term before, and we all know that it's a major concept in U.S. history. But the quote, the larger sort of context of the quote in the Democratic Review, which is a Democratic Party organ in shape of a sort of Jacksonian Democratic Party coming from the 1830s, is that the fulfillment here is the fuller concept, the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. So right there, you can, if you unpack that, you see a lot of things that are not surprising, right? You see this, it's Providence. This is, the force of this migration, the displacement of Native Americans in particular, is something which God wants, right? And we don't question that. And again, I'm putting it specifically a Christian context, but you can talk about providence in a more abstract context as well. And again, I talked about these roots in Puritan eschatology. The other thing I wanted to talk about, and I find this kind of there's a lot of different reasons for this, and I am fascinated by and very interested in Mormon history. It's one of the many things that I'm really interested in. I think Mormonism, and particularly early Mormonism, notwithstanding 20th century Mormonism and the massive global success of the Mormon Church in the West, but the history of Mormonism is in many ways, in the history of Joseph Smith and the history of the founding of the faith in upstate New York in the 1830, the writing of the Book of Mormon, it's one of the most extraordinary, and you could not write a novel that fits so much unusual history in one place than in the story of Mormonism. I talk about it in all my courses because it's often so important to understand these religions and faiths that emerge specifically in the United States, because they are really our entry point to understanding something very deep about the American character and how it gets projected into notions of destiny, providence, and Mormonism. I mean, quick sort of story about Mormonism, and I need to move on because there's lots more I want to talk about, but Mormonism is an eschatological faith, right? We live in an eschatological country. We live in a country that, Thomas Jefferson thought that the world was 5,000 years old. We live on a country that's founded during a period of time, notwithstanding Enlightenment ideals of all men being created equal. We live in a country that had as its vision that the people lived on an island of time which was imminently going to end. That you had a small number of generations that had lived on the face of the earth, because if the earth's only 5,000 somewhat years old, you can count the number of generations, you can count to your great, right? And so the notion of, and this goes into notions of science, like the notions of denial of, that any species are actually extinct, right? What are these bones? All that sort of stuff. And Thomas Jefferson, for instance, is a good example of this. And not to excuse Thomas Jefferson and his actions, but it's to understand the limited nature of and really limited nature, limited in terms of how we understand the cosmos today and time. I really think that's really a key to understanding these roots when we look at the 1770s, 1780s, 1790s into the 18 teens, understanding these myopic roots from which this grand experiment of democracy really grew from. And it still has that myopia kind of bound up into it. Nevertheless, not to, getting to religious issues but anyway, eschatological faiths are those that believe in an imminent end in time. And certainly the Puritans fit that bill, as did the Mormons. The Mormons today call themselves, the name of the church is the Church of Latter-day Saints, right? Latter day, it's a latter day, it's the last days. That's the belief system of, many different faiths in the United States, many different Christian-based faiths. Although the enmity between evangelicals and Mormons is high. There's a whole other sub-story there. There's many evangelicals, especially Southern Baptists, that believe that Mormonism is not Christian. There's a whole subtext to that. But nevertheless, the story of Mormonism is that Joseph Smith has these revelations. He writes this book. Nobody really knows, even to this day, how he's able to write a book in the style of the King James Bible. But he writes this book, which he says is channeled by the angel Moroni. He discovers these gold plates. He's able to translate these gold plates. That whole part I have to skip over, even though it's fascinating. But one of the things that we have to understand about, if we look at some of the things in the Book of Mormon, and you read into it, and you read it like a literary work as opposed to a work of faith, you see like the narrative of what happens. And I think you all know the dim narrative that's in the Book of Mormon, that Jesus, after he was resurrected, came to the New World. In fact, there's a large group, there's a rather large and thriving group of Mormon archaeologists that tried to prove this in one way or another, or prove the events in the Book of Mormon as having actually occurred in historical time, and engage in archaeology to that effect. And then if you read the Book of Mormon, there's this narrative about there being this group called the Lamanites. The Lamanites who are basically one of the groups that Jesus encounters who reject Jesus's teaching, right? And then actually end up exterminating those who Jesus converts way back when. So the Lamanites then become Native Americans. The Lamanites are the ancestors of Native Americans. And so you can see this element of justification for Native American displacement bound up religiously in the text, right? No matter where you think the text came from. And in Mormonism, when you look back, and Mormonism today is one of the things that's quite fascinating about Mormonism is the way that it's able to reinvent itself, because at the head of the Mormon Church, there is, the leader of the Mormon Church is able to have revelations that just legitimately change whatever happened before. It's kind of supple that way. It's kind of you think of the American Constitution as a way of preserving the kind of dynamism of a people as opposed to a monarchy. Well, Mormonism has it, but it comes from one person. So it's kind of an interesting switch. But in Mormonism, and today, many of these older racist policies that the Mormon Church had in Utah have really been revelatoried out in a way. They've kind of been, the leader has a revelation and then they've been erased, such as that, African Americans could not become priests in the Mormon Church. That was current all the way into the early 1970s. And one of the assumptions in Mormonism, or at least was that, and you find this in a lot of the literature from Brigham Young, from many of the Mormon elders of the 19th century, that as the Lamanites, or as Native Americans, as they became closer to European culture, read, Mormon culture, they will become, and this is a quote, will become a white and delightsome people, that their skin color will actually change to the degree to which they are able to alter their behavior and alter their acculturation into American society. So I think talking about Mormonism, this is nothing to say anything against Mormonism or the faith or anything like that, because the history of the faith is a controversial one, because it exists in historical time, and so there's many people who are devout Mormons who believe in the historicity of the Book of Mormon. But nevertheless, it's something to it's kind of a fascinating way of looking at the West and looking at how Native Americans then are seen by the wider American society, because there's nothing unusual about how Mormons are depicting this. It's just that the Mormon faith is developing in a way in which it's incorporating many of these ideas which are widespread in American society. One example, and I could go on about this, is about the denial that Native Americans could actually achieve what they were able to achieve in terms of their cities and pyramids, et cetera, ascribing that, for instance, to Celtic influence, or the Irish who arrived over here, or lost tribes, right? And that was a really common thing right around the time that Mormonism was a birthing in the 1830s and 1840s. So you find a lot of these notions of a people other than Native Americans having built many of these works as being responsible for it, as opposed to Native Americans. So that's just and I think that's a really just I just find that really interesting. Don't get me started about Mormonism and space travel, and because that's a fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I've written about that before, actually, in my dissertation. But Mormonism is really birthing right when modern astronomy is emerging, and so you have this really fascinating synergy between how the Mormons are thinking about heaven and how they're thinking about space. Is really just I find that anyway. Fascinating topic. But I want to talk about stereotypes, and I want to move on to one of the, I think I might have mentioned this before, but about I don't know if I mentioned this before. I mentioned this a lot in my classes, but this is a particularly appropriate class to mention it in. It is regarding the way how American culture in a media landscape, as well as in a how modern America, we're talking about, say, 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, modern urbanizing America is beginning to depict Native Americans. And you have this tension between what you might see when we get to, say, Westerns of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the depiction of Native Americans in moving picture medium, then television. And so there's two types of people, and this goes to any characterization of the other in general. We saw this in the kind of totally conflicting views as to the suitability of African Americans to be soldiers, right? There's one racist narrative that says, oh, they're weak and docile and they won't be good fighters. And then there's one that says they're disorganized and they're too strong. So they both of them are kind of totally flying in the face of each other. But the depiction of the Sioux, and the Sioux are so important to understand as a people and as a way of seeing how stereotypes about Native Americans get filtered into the larger mass culture of the United States in the latter half of the 19th and early 20th century. Because the Sioux are really, the Sioux are one of the last peoples to not be forced onto reservations by the U.S. Army, right? And they inhabit that area of the grasslands in the West. And I mentioned this early on in one of the earliest lessons about how this was marginal land. This was not where a large portion of Native Americans lived. This was, it also was not very good for Native American habitation prior to 1492 because there were no horses. There was no such thing as a horse in America prior to 1492 because they're brought over by the Spanish. And so the Sioux are depicted when you see these movie Westerns of the Sioux on horseback, hunting buffalo, like in Dances with Wolves and things like this. That's great to sort of understand where the Sioux were in maybe the 19th century to a limited extent. But it doesn't make any sense in relation to thinking about the larger span of Native American history. But what happens also is understanding the Sioux in relation to photography. And I'll play this short little thing. I'll try to shut off the sound because it has the music. That photography comes about in the 1840s, 1850s, right? Around that period of time is when you start to have the ability to sort of, tote camera around and take pictures. And the documentation of the Sioux is happening at a time when there's already been, 350 years of all of the wars, all of the, the sort of artistic depictions of Native Americans, right? But it's the depiction of the Sioux, especially through the photographs of Edward Curtis and others, which become the stand-in stereotype for Native Americans in general for the next 150, 160 years. The Native American with the headdress and how the Sioux look, the teepee and all of that become those stereotypes. They become the movie Western stereotype of all Native Americans, even though Native Americans are obviously a hugely rich span of different peoples with different, who don't know each other also, which is something we'll get into. So the Sioux take on that. And so when we look at the lens of Native Americans today, and we can look at this in the depictions of sports teams mascots, we can look at this, and it's the Sioux which become that kind of poster for it, right? This goes through the Buffalo Bill Wild West shows, which depict the Sioux as the prototypical Native American, this noble, group of Native Americans on the frontier who are warlike and is in one sense dangerous, in one sense, the true, passing inheritance of the West. So but it's important to understand the way that we see, or at least how the wider culture sees Native Americans is so simplistic because it's filtered through these cultural assumptions and cultural stereotypes that occurred at the dawn of photography. Because photography is supposed to represent reality, but it's only representing this one moment in Native American history that's reality, and the Sioux sort of occupy that. So I think that's a really important thing to keep reminding ourselves about how Native Americans are depicted in general in American society. And the history of photography in relation to almost anything that goes on in the 1840s and 1850s is just one of those, the American environmentalism, the American landscape, all of that. The history of photography tells us a lot that, frankly, a lot of historians often ignore. There's other things that are occurring in American society during this period of time, which are characterizing Native Americans as both the other, but are also creating an alternative reality about Native Americans, that they are the term becomes the noble savage, right? That they are the true spiritual roots of the American West, but they're disappearing, right? So there's this kind of lamentation there about their disappearing, which of course is, made more possible through their, sort of herding them onto reservations and making them stay in particular areas. And you have this during events like the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, which I find one of these touchstone events in American society, because there's so many things that are going on with the Battle of Little Bighorn. Chief Joseph is another thing which I might get to depending on time, but and there's a lot to unpack here racially and ethnically when we talk about the Buffalo Soldiers and the Buffalo Soldiers' role in what were called the Indian Wars after the Civil War. Battle of Little Bighorn, 1876. We all basically know the story. George Armstrong Custer, leads a group of American soldiers to kind of runs right into Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse's camp. Custer foolishly basically just stumbles into the camp with armed American soldiers. A fight ensues, and every single American soldier is killed. The entire group is wiped out. And two narratives, though, happen, and these two narratives are still here in our society today. I think the narrative that Custer had it coming to him is today the more dominant narrative of this. But you have to remember, this is a U.S. army. I mean, these are American soldiers who in 1876 are fully massacred, fully killed, because that's, it was war, fully killed in the Battle of Little Bighorn. The story of the Battle of Little Bighorn, though, right, the story becomes, and I'm getting a direct message about how the last stand is this construction. Yeah, Custer's last stand, and this image of Custer being the last one standing and bravely, fighting, these Native Americans who are, screaming all around him, becomes this image of, the American soldier stalwartly moving the manifest destiny into the face of, savagery, into the face of the frontier. That's the dominant narrative in the 1870s. Custer was kind of a Civil War hero. So you have this element of these Civil War, and this was really common, Civil War soldiers and officers then making their career by going out west and fighting on the battlefield. You see this depicted, kind of cartoonishly in Dances with Wolves, for instance. The Kevin Costner character kind of does that, but does that from a point of injury. So Custer, but the other narrative that emerges with Custer is that he had it coming to him, and you still see this today. There's many people that Western collectors who love talking about Custer, love talking about the Custer's Last Stand, the Battle of Little Bighorn, all the history about it. But the other part of this is that sympathy in the East and sympathy for the Native American plight, starts to emerge. I mean, there's a whole series of other terrible things that happen to Native Americans, that you have this tension between the good intentions that some characterize laws regarding Native Americans for, such as the Dawes Act of 1887, which seeks to, at least in its writing, when you read it, seeks to assimilate Native Americans into American culture, and does that by saying, okay, well, notwithstanding Indian removal in the Trail of Tears in the 1830s, which displaced many of, we saw the Lenape tribe, which displaces many of those peoples west of the Mississippi to completely unarable land in Oklahoma that there's no possibility of really making this to a growing farming concern. And so they're displaced there and allowed to have some sort of tribal identity in a large swath of Oklahoma, which, by the way, used to be called on maps, and you can still see it if you get an 1890s map, it says Indian Territory. For most of Oklahoma, it was called Indian Territory before it became Oklahoma. Well, that's where a lot of the Trail of Tears Native Americans are removed to and are forced to. That's where the migration of the Cherokee, for instance, goes straight out to Oklahoma, west of the Mississippi. But the Dawes Act kind of because that land then becomes the object of the desires of migrants coming from the South and the North to this, sort of amorphous South-North area in the Kansas and Oklahoma period. It becomes the area between the Rockies and the Mississippi, which is not the best farmland, but America's kind of filling in terms of it being parceled out and sold. Those areas where Native Americans have been removed in Oklahoma then become the object of sale. And so under the Dawes Act, what they do is they take that land and they say, well, Native Americans are not living like modern peoples, right? They're not living like the Anglo settlers. They must be taught to live not in these communal, large tribal arrangements. They need to be taught to live like, mom and dad and 2.5 children, they like the European standard or American standard family. And so they cut up all of this land and they say, okay, each Native American family run by the dad, right, of course, supposedly, then is going to receive an allotment of the carving up of this land. And you can see kind of echoes of 40 Acres and a Mule to a certain extent, where African Americans are denied any sort of recompense after the Civil War and we'll go into that next time when we talk about Jim Crow. So Native Americans are given some amount of land. There is some amount of, at least the justification is that they should be given some land because this is their land, but they have to live like European families. Well, of course, what happens is speculators come in, this land is completely unusable. You have here, the explicit selling of that land, Indian land for sale, because what happens is speculators come in, they give a pittance to many of these families for that particular land, which they can't use anyway, for the most part, and they didn't want, because it's like a patch of dry earth that they have really no use for, and they can't live there uncommunally. And then all of that land is then sold to another round of speculators that come out west. Usually not individuals. There's usually people who already have money that are buying up a lot of it and then going back east and putting up posters like this and selling it. So that is that again, characterizes good intentions, characterizes it's supposed to bring Native Americans into the American fold, and of course it results in one of the last of the terrible insults in the late 19th century towards Native Americans. That culminates, of course, in the Ghost Dance tragedy, in which at the Massacre of Wounded Knee, when this should actually be Wovoka, that is spelled wrong. There is a sort of spiritual movement that takes place across the West, initiated by Wovoka, in which he says that there's this dance called the Ghost Dance that becomes a sort of a pan-Native American project. It starts in Nevada, but then moves its way out west, that the more the dance is done, the more the world will go back to what it was prior to European expansion. Of course, whites interpret that as that's kind of some sort of, they're exterminating us through some sort of spiritual practice, although it's a spiritual practice. Nevertheless, what happens is at Wounded Knee, soldiers go in and massacre hundreds of elderly men, women, and children in 1890. And this is usually seen as the nadir of Native American in fact, the book "Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee" by Dee Brown explicitly is a sort of characterizing Wounded Knee as the lowest point of the Native American history up until that point. And I don't want to go into this because it's 12:30. But one thing I did want to mention is that when we talk about Native American identity, and we will get back to Asian identity and Asian exclusion next time, we have to understand that because Native Americans are hundreds, if not thousands, of different peoples and languages and cultures, there is no pan-Native American identity except that which forms under the duress of European of Anglo expansion. So things like, Native Americans did not have citizenship. Well, they had reservations, they had sovereign reservations, so that was considered, sort of, which were forced on them. But you also have this, like, for instance, the herding or the taking away of Native American children to put them in common boarding schools is one of the places where, paradoxically, many of these children start to have a larger Native American identity as opposed to the people's identity that they have. They never shed that individual people's identity. There's always that intricacy. But the idea that Native Americans need to advocate as a people together in order to fight back against these terrible things that have been done over the intervening centuries, that really starts to come about in the 20th century. And so largely as a result of this boarding school solidarity, and then also as a result of just a mass media and the wider understanding of themselves. And we'll get to that when we talk about the 1960s and 70s social movements, especially with the Native American movement, American Indian movement, AIM, and the